Hey, NAMI says, Mr. Yance again. See if we can progress through the brain a little bit more today. You can see on the screen kind of where we left off on last section of notes. So we're mainly going over the blue and the red areas of the brain. We're going to say this big cerebrum for part 2 of notes. Okay, so we're going to talk about the midbrain, which is right here, which I kind of talked a little bit about the other day. I want to go in a little more detail with it today. So the midbrain is basically called the mesencephalon, which simply means it's right dead center of the brain. It lies just above the pons, which we talked about the other day, and just below the cerebrum. So, I mean, it's tucked right in the center of the brain, okay? There's basically got weird names, but there's two parts to the midbrain. There's something called the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, and those are two names. The superior and inferior we've had before. This means above and below. The superior colliculi contains the visual centers, so everything we see, that's where it's going to go, is through the superior colliculi. We talked about in last notes the optic nerves, the optic chiasma, and how they cross. This is where they go. Okay, that's basically where those visual images we see every day go through. Inferior sound. And we are a very auditory center. So we are a very visual, auditory creature as humans. A lot of the things we learn, a lot of things that we do comes through the eyes and the ears. That's just the way we are. So those are two important structures for that. The pituitary gland, good answer to the quiz that you're going to take, is the master gland. And it controls all the hormones of the body, a very tiny structure, just this little bitty thing right here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. We'll get it later. But the pituitary gland controls all the hormones, your growth, all those things that we use those for. All right. I mainly want to get to these next two things today. One's called the hippocampus and one's called the amygdala. And they're part of what we call the limbic system, which are your emotions. The hippocampus is a well-named structure. Check this out on the screen. You can see why we call it a seahorse. This is what it looks like. There's this real seahorse on the right. You can see where it gets its name, hippocampus. Pretty easy to see that. It's right here. And basically it in blue kind of curls around here. And basically it has a big role in memory. So we'll talk a lot about it in the cerebrum part of notes, part 2. So it's named after a seahorse, but it plays a big role in how we store memories. Okay, now, why is it part of the limbic system, the emotional part? That's what I want to get to next. We have this structure called the amygdala, which is this almond-shaped, really tiny structure, a lot like the hippocampus or a lot like the hypothalamus. And it's got to do with emotional events. And we store memories. The reason we talk about the hippocampus and the amygdala together is because they're side by side. And a lot of times we store a emotion with a memory. Now, what happens is when we recall that memory, guess what comes with that? Those emotions. That's great if we're remembering our wedding day, the birth of a child, something like that, graduation, prom, whatever, major events we have, that's great. But if it's a fear thing or a bad memory, that's not always a good thing. You can see why sometimes people have really bad things happen in their life and they sometimes repress those memories because the emotion comes with the memory. Okay, let me show you a quick video to explain this a little bit. Oops, maybe my fault. That's not what I wanted to do. See if we can do this again. There we go.
And you have to consider the brain having evolved like an old house, where we just added different rooms. So there's all these stairways and connections. In the basement is the oldest part, called the brain stem. It's something we share with reptiles and other mammals. It's what keeps us alive, governing vital functions like heart rate, respiration, digestion, and blood pressure. Things that happen without having to think about them. The next level up, the first floor, more evolved. Hundreds of thousands of years later, it's called the limbic system. This is very important in the processing of emotions. Within the limbic system are the amygdala, two nuggets of tissue, one in each half of the brain. They are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they are the brain's central command center for our emotional reactions. One of the simplest and strongest of these is fear, a primal emotion we all share.
If you had to pick one brain region that was most important in fear, it would be the amygdala.
There's no better place to explore how fear affects the brain than here at the Navy SEAL Special Warfare Command in San Diego, California. Recruits are put through specialized training to change the way their brains react to fear.
We introduce our students almost from day one to absolute chaos. And they will struggle. When you look at historic mistakes on the battlefield, they're almost always associated with fear or with panic. So the capacity to control these impulses is extremely important.
Out of 140 candidates who start each class, on average, only 36 make the final cut. Successful recruits seem better able to adapt their brains to the demands of the job.
It's not really necessarily the physical people who get through there. There have been Olympic athletes who have dropped out of training. And there's this 140-pound farm kid from Nebraska who'd never seen the ocean before, and he graduated. Why is that?
To answer that question, the Navy turned to neuroscience. When confronted with fear, it's the amygdala that responds to information from our senses and instinctively presses the body's panic button.
The amygdala is actually one of the most interconnected regions of the brain. So it actually will both send signals to parts of the brainstem that now elicit a range of bodily responses. You start to sweat, your heart races, you might freeze for a while, you might run away.
This exercise, known as the hooded box drill, is part of the close quarters defense system and is one of the ways the U.S. Navy conditions its recruits to control these amygdala signals.
Our students are deaf and blind. Our instructors will set up a scenario, and then the hood comes off, and the student has to respond.
Well, when you're under that hood, you have just a moment to kind of gather your thoughts and think of scenarios that could come your way.
Sometimes the correct response is swift and lethal. Sometimes it's nonviolent. It's supposed to simulate those quick snapshot situations, those high-risk situations that just happen in an instant.
They're trying to introduce you to the fact that panic is going to be less and less an option throughout your career.
Okay, so you can kind of see from that video, it's kind of insane how panic and fear can affect how you do things. And obviously, if you're a Navy SEAL in a combat zone, you got to learn to repress that. Not that it doesn't happen, but you learn how to handle it. You know, I talk a lot about this with my first aid training. You know, you have to be able to suppress that panic button because you got to take care of that person and jump in there and do what's right. And sometimes that's easier to do if you don't know the person. When it's a loved one, a family member that's laying there having a heart attack or severely bleeding or something like that, then you have to learn to kind of repress that. And you may look like you're under control and everything's good, but inside you're probably not. So that's something you have to, interesting. I mean, fear is something that is a very individual thing. A lot of times it's got something to do with past experiences. So here comes that memory, that past experience. Maybe you're afraid of dogs, so you had a bad experience with dogs. Maybe you're afraid of snakes or spiders or something like that. That's a very unique thing and very individual thing. But we can override that, but it's very difficult sometimes. And there's the amygdala, not a real big structure, okay? So basically in review, we've looked at some of these structures that you see here on the sheep brain, and we talked about how they work in our brains. Just mainly this middle part, okay? We're mainly going to hit these two parts later, okay? And to kind of wrap notes up for today, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, they all work together. And that's why we call it the limbic system. They're all next to each other because they're all functioning in that one unit and doing your emotions, all right? All right, so that should wrap up notes for today. Hopefully, we'll finish up notes on the next set, and then we'll take our test next week. So have a good day, and we'll see you later. Bye.